Well, hello good people. Unless you're completely half-witted and didn't read the film title, it probably doesn't take a great deal of guessing as to what is in this paper parcel. It's a full set of pre-war Aeronca flying and landing wires. There's 12 big wires for the main planes and then 4 small wires for the tailplane. I'm really pleased with them. They came off an airplane that's known as Gladys, and Gladys is probably the most original Aeronca C3 in the UK. It's one of the 16 that was imported along with my ship back in 1935-36. That airplane was stored away in 1939 and didn't fly again until the late 1980s, possibly early 1990s, when Ben and Jan Cooper rebuilt it. It's a super airplane. I've flown it quite a few times. They were bought some years ago by a chap who's rebuilding an Aeronca 100. But the problem with the Aeronca 100 is it has different landing wires to the C3. I'll show you some pictures, and of course, just to muddy the waters slightly, I'll show you mine as well. Aeroplane, that is, not something else. When the Aeronca C3 was built in the United Kingdom as the Aeronca 100, the Air Ministry, for reasons best known to themselves, decided it had to be built out of thicker tubing, forward landing wires on the main plane, and the tailplane landing wires had to be doubled. The wooden ailerons and the rudder had to be mass balanced with several pounds of lead. All these changes added about 40 pounds to the empty weight of the aircraft, with no tangible benefit whatsoever. The British-built Taylor craft, later known as the Oster, was similarly afflicted. I'll make a film about the history of my machine at some point, but if you look at this photograph from the early 1950s, you'll notice it's got double landing wires and double tailplane wires. As retrieved from a farm shed in Woking, it had no ailerons and no flying wires, and so was rebuilt using the ailerons and wires and many metal fittings from this aircraft. You'll note the ailerons on my machine don't have those ridiculous balance weights either. It's flown for the last 70 years without them. Just as pleasing as the 16 serviceable wires is half a set of Lunkenheimer fittings. These are the proper Aeronca fittings, and unlike the fittings that are on my C3 now, with those Brunton wires which just have a nut that butts up to the end of the fitting up to here and no thread on the outside, these Lunkenheimer ones use a nut that compresses the fitting slightly onto the wire, thus the fitting grasps the wire properly. I've got all the tailplane ones. There's 4 left hand, 4 right hand, and then I've got 5 big left hand ones, 6 right hand ones. I need another 13 fittings. I'm just going to use modern fork ends because the ones inside the wing can't be seen anyway, and one outside, well, it doesn't matter in the least. I'm not going to worry about Lunkenheimer fittings unless I find some more, but it's really nice it's got some originals. I think there's 12 still inside Gladys's wings, but that's where they should live. They've been in there nearly 90 years. I want to take all the paint and loose dirt off them, so I think I'm going to soak them in cellulose thinners. I found a jar. I put an extra L on Lloyd Grossman. He looks different without his glasses, so I think Lloyd can be a lefty. He probably is anyway. And I'll put all these fittings in here. And I found another jar somewhere. Here we are. It was nearly alphabetically correct, so I've just changed Patax to Ratax, and that can have all the right hand fittings. Well, they look like 2 very unhealthy specimens already, but we'll give them a couple of days to soak and then clean them off on the wire wheel. I want to strip the wires as well. They're pretty good and there doesn't seem to be much corrosion on them, but obviously I want to take the paint off. And so I think I'll soak those in thinners as well. I just had a monkey around and I found this length of steel tube. So I'm just going to weld an end on it. It's exactly the right length. Those wires are 48 inches long and so is this piece of tube. If I blank off one end with a square, So I weld a square on there, then I can put the wires in and fill it up with thinners as well. There'll be minimal evaporation, and I think that'll take the paint off fairly quickly. I brazed this end on because I happen to have the torch out anyway. Actually, brazing it was far easier than messing around with the arc welder. And yesterday I made a new camera mount for the Aeronca C3. It shortens the arm considerably. I'm hoping there's enough adjustment. I wanted to braze a bolt into it anyway. This end of the tube had some really nasty burrs. I don't want to scratch the wires as they go in and out. That will put stress risers in and possibly scrap them. So that's all been filed thoroughly and deburred. So put the wires in. I found a rather ancient tin of thinners in the back of the workshop. It shouldn't really be this colour, but it doesn't matter for cleaning, etc. I don't quite know how much it needs. Not that much. There's not that much space. I suppose we can just pour it till it comes out the top. Sounds like it's getting fairly full. Oh yeah, just off the top. Excellent. Well, we'll give that a couple of days and that should take the paint off. These have had more shakes than OPEC conference in Riyadh. So again, a couple more days, leave them in soak, and then we'll take the whole lot out and see how much paint's come off. The Lunkenheimer fittings have been soaking for a couple of days. Time to clean them up. The wires have been soaking for about a week now. I have taken them out of here a few times and wiped them off with a cloth, and it's taken all the paint off, and there doesn't seem to be much wrong with them at all. I'm going to just clean the ends here with the wire wheel, and then I'm actually going to clean the edges and sides with wire wool and fine wet and dry. I'm not going to run the wire wheel across them in a sort of crosswards fashion, because that might put stress risers in them. And there's sort of little areas of corrosion, but it's not deep corrosion, it's just a very light surface rust. So I think wire wool is a good start. If it doesn't work, then I can always try something a little more aggressive. I've got some Scotch-Brite as well. The wires have cleaned up a treat. I used 800 wet and dry, and used it wet to polish any marks out. Wire wool and Scotch-Brite. Each wire had a good half hour or so. I was going to try and rig the tail, but the weather is very iffy at the moment. We keep having rain showers. I don't want to push everything outside. and then get it wet. So I'm going to get the wires painted and we'll have a go at rigging the tail in a while. I haven't painted any of the fittings as yet, they're just cleaned off and sprayed with light oil in the bags. I'll paint them once the thing's been rigged, because I think messing around with the jam nuts and all the rest of it is just a lot of chance of chipping the paint. Actually, because the Aeronca has undercarriage legs like a Dachshund and rubs its tummy in the grass, I tend to cover the lower fittings, these fork ends and everything, with Vaseline on the C3, on the main plane landing wires and on the tail wires. In fact, the tail wires, even though they're painted black, they're smothered in Vaseline too, because it all gets a bit damp in the long grass and it seems to prevent corrosion. Makes them very easy to clean as well. Well, it's about 3 weeks later. The wires are nice and dry, so we'll have a go at rigging the tail this afternoon. This is the first dry day in weeks. I've been away working, but my wife says it's just rained and rained and the ground is soaking. I would have possibly flown the C3 this afternoon, but the airstrip's even wetter than Rishi Sunak. There's no point chewing up the grass just for a half-hour flight and getting mud everywhere. I did rig the tail once before, and I made, of course, some nice wires with aeroplane string, 1/8 of an inch aeroplane string, and turnbuckles. So I'm going to put the tail on using these, and then we'll swap them over with the new wires. That's the tail rigged. It all went together quite well. The wires are rigged and tight. It's all square. I'm going to replace them one by one with the flying wires if they turn out to be the right length once the fittings have been put on the end. But I want to show you something first. One of the many admirable things about these Aeroncas is how one part does more than one job. This is a stud going all the way through from there to there. 1/4 inch. It's threaded 1/4 inch UNF. And it has a couple of barrel nuts. These will be drilled eventually for a little split pin through there and through there. That's how the C3 is already. But I've just made the barrel nuts for now without drilling them. So obviously you put a screwdriver on the end without an elevator in place. But as well as holding the tail planes on, being the rear fitting, it also acts as the pivot for the elevator bell crank. And the elevators themselves, which just push onto the tail planes, then bolt through, so obviously elevator this side as well, 1/4 inch bolts, packing pieces between the elevator and the bell crank if needed, and the whole lot moves up and down, very easy. It means if you take the tail off the airplane at any time as well, if you want to de-rig the tail like this, you don't actually need to take any control cables off. It's merely withdraw the 2 1/4 inch bolts that hold the elevator on and it slides outwards and off. It's all very clever. I've fitted the Lunkenheimer fittings to the end of the wires. These are the upper wires. The upper wires are about 1 inch shorter than the lower wires. And all I want to do to start off with is hold up the wire against the top fitting. I can slide it on the little bolt that I slid through there because it doesn't have any clevis pins, and try it. Now that's about right. There's still about 3/8 of an inch, even 1/2 inch of travel left on the fittings to be able to shorten them a little bit more. And so it needs to have another cable tang very similar to this one. Now these tangs I made for the steel wires, I countersunk them slightly so the thimble would sit nicely in the tang, because I didn't want to go to the expense or weight of putting a shackle and another pin through there when I could get away with just putting the cable through a tang. It's a bit of a microlight way of doing things, but it does save weight, particularly if you do it several times on several cables. I'll do the same this side. So all I did was hook the Lunkenheimer fitting over the bolt and then brought the wire around and tried it against the other cable. If we pull the flying wire straight and down to that cable tang, again there's about at least 3/8 of an inch of play still left on the flying wire, and that cable tang is about the right length. But again, I need to change the tang and make one with a parallel hole and not counterboard as these ones are. So those top wires fit. I'm going to hook that on there, and then we'll try it against the tang at the other end. There we are. The wire's a little bit shorter. If the hole in the tang, if the tang was another 1/2 inch long, that would be perfect. Now, I will fess up to having messed around off camera. You wouldn't expect anything else. And I have adjusted these fittings so the wire is, well, as long as, not quite as long as it can go actually. I've got the end of the wire on both ends just inside the fork end. So it's in complete safety because it's almost all the way through the fork end to here. Now, I suppose I could wind them out a little bit more, and maybe I will, but I think I need to make some slightly longer cable tangs, at least with another, well, I think 1/2 inch to be honest, looking at it, certainly 3/8. After all, if I make a tang and it's not quite right, I can always make another one. But that cable fits okay, so let's try the last cable on the other side, the lower cable. No great surprises, just like the other one. It's about 1/2 inch short. Again, the wire is in safety most of the way, so I've got a little bit to play with in terms of distance. But I think another cable tang there that's 1/2 inch longer will solve the problem completely. Incidentally, you might be looking at the rather hairy cable end there, which is horrible of course and very easy to stab yourself with. I know one can use heat shrink and sort of slide some on before making cables. I wrap mine in rib stitching cord or cotton string, so bind them down tight and then give them a few coats of clear dope and they go nice and solid and hard, and that stops the nasty cable ends sticking out. I would have done that were I to use these cables. It gives them a nice kind of rustic finish, if rustic is an aeronautical term. So the tailplane wires fit, but I need to make some new cable tangs, which I expected to do. I was actually going to cheat and chop the old ones off just for the purposes of rigging it this afternoon, but I'm not, for a couple of reasons. When I did the top wires, you might have noticed, the eagle-eyed amongst you, that I've got the fitting wound down enough that the wire is actually through the Lunkenheimer fitting. I'll get some focus there. So the wires obviously need to be cut down a little bit. Now I can cut them down so they're just in sort of the top of the fitting there again, so they need 1/2 inch off, I suppose. It's only this end, the other end is fine. There's still about 1/4 inch of play there where the fitting can come down further. Likewise at the other end, so there's nearly 1/2 inch of further shortness if it's needed. I think though, before I go around chopping up flying wires, particularly lovely original ones, even by shortening them 1/2 inch or so, I think I need to put the fuselage outside, put plumb lines around, and instead of running around with the spirit level like I did in a tape measure, I'm pretty happy the tail is actually rigged properly, but I think I need to measure twice and cut once. So, well, there's another episode, I suppose. After all, I bored you all to death with 6 episodes of making a blasted propeller for the Praga engine, so we'll have more flying wires in a while, and then even more flying wires. Well, would you believe it's beginning to spit now, so I'm going to put all this away. I know the Aeronca C2 hasn't really had enough attention in the last year or so, apart from some engine runs, but actually getting these flying wires has really given me a bit of a boost. So I'm hoping to make a lot more progress on it soon, and there'll be far more regular updates. As always, thanks for watching.